I'm going to move straight away to ask Eoghan to take the next piece. Again, Eoghan is from the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Data Addiction.
Thanks, Ryan.
And he's going to present out to us. Eoghan has, he does have 20 minutes, but he's committed to me he's going to do it in 18 and 17 just to make the last 2 minutes. So well done, Eoghan. Thanks for that.
Morning, everybody. Thanks very much, Paul. Okay, so I'm just going to give you an overview of the European Drug Report. This is the EMCDDA's main analysis of Europe's resilient and complex drug situation. It looks at drug use, related harms, and drug markets. And it's accompanied by our statistical bulletin, where you'll find the data underlying the analysis. It's available in 25 languages in PDF on our website. And it's also accompanied by our look back over 25 years of the EU early warning system on new psychoactive substances. And it draws on the latest modules of our EU drug markets analysis and the responses guide to drug problems in Europe. Our main headline message is that drug supply and use have both begun to bounce back following disruptions during COVID-19, and indicators of supply and use are already starting to return to pre-pandemic levels. Looking at stimulants like cocaine, crack cocaine, amphetamine, and methamphetamine, through wastewater analysis, we can see that there were increases in some cities of the residues detected for these drugs between 2020 and 2021. Innovation is driving the high availability of a greater diversity and range of substances on the drug market. These substances are increasingly more potent, and it's also driving more complex patterns of drug consumption. We're still seeing that there is increased seizures of large shipments trafficked through Europe's seaports in intermodal containers. We're seeing that there is new trafficking routes emerging, along with new concealment routes and also new production processes. And the European Union remains a significant producer of some drugs, both for domestic consumption and for global export. Europe's drug problems have become more complex, and we summarise this with the phrase everywhere, everything, everyone. What we mean by that is that drug problems are today appearing almost everywhere. We can see them manifest in and exacerbating issues such as homelessness, youth criminality, the management of psychiatric disorders, but also violence and intimidation in communities related to the operation of drug markets, or changes in the flow of drugs internationally in developments in Afghanistan or the war in Ukraine. Almost everything with psychoactive potential can appear as a drug, often mislabeled in mixtures or powders. A key example of cannabis adulterated with synthetic cannabinoids, and everyone can be affected, whether at the level of the individual through accessing drug treatment, or indeed in the communities where drug markets are operating and may be resulting in intimidation and fear, or corruption and criminal practices taking place in institutions. Looking at the area of new psychoactive substances, we had about one new drug notified per week in 2021. 52 overall were notified to the EU early warning system on new psychoactive substances. The system's currently monitoring 880 substances overall, and we can see the diversity of what's available on the drug market from the fact that 370 of these previously detected substances appeared on the market in 2020. We had a record seizure of 6.9 tonnes of MPS in 2020, and this is also accompanied by an increase in 15 new synthetic cannabinoids, 6 new synthetic opioids, and 6 new synthetic cathinones detected in 2021. And synthetic cathinones are linked with a range of harms, and this has prompted concerns. The early warning system is now monitoring 162 of these, the second largest group after synthetic cannabinoids. There was about 3.3 tonnes of this material seized in 2020, up from 3/4 of a tonne in 2019. Mostly it was a small number of very large seizures of Indian origin of these 3 drugs. And these drugs are linked with a range of harms, and we can see an example here of increased poisonings in the Netherlands related to 3-MMC. But cathinone injecting is also linked to a range of harms such as high-risk sexual practices and also HIV and HCV outbreaks, which have been seen in some European cities over the last decade. And these substances, 3-MMC and 3-CMC, were risk assessed in 2021 and then controlled by the European Commission in March 2022. Cannabis remains Europe's most popular illicit drug, and about 15.5% or 15 million 15 to 34-year-olds are estimated to have used it in the last year, according to surveys. If we go down a bit, we can see among 15 to 24-year-olds, this was 19.1%, or 9 million of that age group. In about 86,000 seizures in 2020, 584 tons of cannabis resin was seized. In about 240,000 seizures, 155 tons of cannabis herb was seized. And this is an increase on 2019, where we had 464 tons of cannabis resin seized and 130 tons of cannabis herb seized. And resin's average tetrahydrocannabinol content, that's the main ingredient in cannabis, is now twice that of herbs, 21% versus 11%. And cannabis is responsible for about 80,000 people accessing drug treatment in Europe, with about 43,000 of those accessing treatment for the first time, and is responsible for about 45% of all first-time treatment entries. Cannabis products have become more complex, and we see now that they are available as extracts and edibles that have a high THC content, but also CBD products with a low THC content on the market. And with this, we see increasing complexity in European cannabis policies, and they now encompass a wider set of areas, including control of illicit cannabis, regulation of cannabis for medical uses, and other emerging uses and forms, including as ingredients in foodstuffs and cosmetics and other commercial products. Some member states in the EU are looking at adjusting their cannabis policies. This includes countries like Germany, Malta, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and most recently Czechia. Medical use of cannabis is available in most EU member states, though the type of access and products available differs considerably between them. And we can get a flavour for the complexity of what's appearing from the increased registrations of cannabis plant varieties, product trademarks, hectares of hemp grown, and applications for novel food products, shops selling low THC products in Europe. And concern continues about adulteration of cannabis with synthetic cannabinoids. And in 2021, there was an increase in detections of ADB butanaka in 11 member states, reporting it at least since July 2020. The concern here is that people may be purchasing what they perceive to be illicit natural cannabis products, but they're in fact adulterated with synthetic cannabinoids. This creates different kinds of risks because synthetic cannabinoids promote more intense intoxication, mental, physical, and behavioral effects than natural cannabinoids, and some fatal and non-fatal poisonings have been associated with these. Synthetic drug production more generally within Europe is escalating, and this is a direct result of increased collaboration between European and international organised crime groups. And we can see here for these 9 drugs, there was over 350 laboratories dismantled in 2020 by European police forces. And we also had police forces seizing precursor chemicals, which are an indication of manufacturing taking place within a country, for another 6 drugs. When we look at cocaine, we can see this trend clearly present. In 2019, there were 5 cocaine laboratories dismantled in the European Union. This rose to 23 in 2020, including large-scale facilities, packaging facilities, secondary extraction facilities, alongside the seizure of coca paste and related processing chemicals. And we had 64,000 seizures of cocaine, resulting in 213 tons of cocaine seized, a record up from 202 tons in 2019. There are about 2.2% of 15 to 34-year-olds, or 2.2 million of that age group, reporting use in the last year through surveys. Wastewater analysis shows us that about 32 out of 58 cities saw an increase in cocaine residue detections between 2020 and 2021. When we look at our index trend for the purity of cocaine, we see that it's risen 40% above the baseline year of 2010, while the price remains relatively stable. All of this together indicates high availability of cocaine on the European market, And with this, we're also seeing increased signs of the spreading of the use of crack cocaine amongst vulnerable groups. But this is also being driven by economic deprivation and the availability of small, cheap crack cocaine doses. It is being seen mainly in people who are in vulnerable groups or experiencing marginalization. This includes people who have primary opioid dependence. There are about 7,000, an estimated 7,000 clients who've received treatment for crack cocaine in 2020 in Europe. And the concern here is that crack cocaine use is linked to high-frequency consumption of the drug, which can lead, in some cases, to rapid mental and physical deterioration and other social problems, including violence, gang-related violence, and financial problems. Drug consumption room clients in Lisbon and Paris are reporting that they are seeing increased dissolving of crack cocaine for injection. This is a concern as it brings elevated risks of HIV and the hepatitis C virus, as well as other problems. Similar dynamics at play in the methamphetamine area, where we see collaboration between European and Mexican organized crime groups aimed at producing large quantities of methamphetamine within Europe, primarily aimed at export to lucrative non-European markets. But there is concern that some of this production could leak onto European markets in the countries where it is produced or the countries that it transits through. Methamphetamine use remains low in Europe, but there are some signs that it could be diffusing to other countries. And in some of the countries where it's been traditionally concentrated, including Germany and Czechia, they do report that some of the methamphetamine that they are now seizing is of European origin, which is a concern. Harms related to methamphetamine include acute drug toxicity, psychotic episodes, polydrug use, and bloodborne viruses from injecting, as well as death. We saw a decline in drug net markets during the pandemic period as a result of increased and targeted policing activity, as well as exit scams by the operators of the markets where they've taken the money from the customers and vanished, but also delivery problems with increasing detection of drugs in packaging in postal and delivery services. A study we did shows us an indication of this, with their revenues dropping to €30,000 a day in 2021, down from $1 million a day in 2020. But we're seeing that social media and instant messaging apps, which have been used for retail-level drug dealing for quite some time, there's been escalation in the extent to which they're being used to fill that space by organized crime groups. Looking at injecting drug use, it is still declining, but it remains a serious concern. And we see that 22% of people who are first-time treatment clients with heroin as their primary drug reported injecting as the main route of use in 2020. And that's down from 35% in 2013. An important difference now is that we see a greater diversity of substances being injected. So we see opioids, heroin, but also amphetamines, cocaine, synthetic cathinones, prescribed opiate medications, and other medicines. Syringe residue analysis by the ESCAPE project shows us that out of 1,300 used syringes analysed between 2020 and 21 in 5 cities, half or more contained stimulants and a third or more contained 2 drugs. This is important because it indicates polydrug use, the use of more than one substance at the same time, or the reuse or sharing of injecting material. And this brings concern around the transmission of bloodborne viruses. In 2020, we had 563 new HIV diagnoses associated with injecting drug use. Half of those were diagnosed late when the immune system had already begun to be compromised by the virus, and this raises concerns about interruption to access to testing and linkage to care during the COVID-19 pandemic. And it comes at a time when we have a concern about access to treatment and harm reduction services generally. Only 4 reporting countries to the EMCDDA met the World Health Organization's targets in 2020 to distribute 200 syringes per person who injects drugs and have 40% of the population of high-risk opioid users in opioid agonist treatment in 2020. We estimate that the prevalence of high-risk opioid use is about 0.34% for the EU adult population, or about 1 million high-risk opioid users in 2020. And about half of this group, or 514,000 people, are accessing treatment. Considerable differences exist between countries in terms of the access and coverage of treatment. And in some countries, it's still inadequate in relation to estimated needs. And this is a concern because enrollment in opioid agonist treatment is an established protective factor against overdose and fatal overdose. And we can see that we have an estimated 5,800 fatal overdoses in the EU in 2020, giving us a mortality rate of 16.7 deaths per million. Polydrug toxicity, so the use of more than one substance at the same time, is the norm, with illicit opioids, other illicit drugs, medicines and alcohol all appearing in the toxicology. But benzodiazepines are prominent in some countries as well, but opioids are present in about 3/4 of all drug-induced deaths. Internationally, we can see that developments in Afghanistan have clear implications for the European drug markets. It remains the world's largest producer of illicit opium and heroin, but now also large-scale ephedra-based methamphetamine production is being detected. After the withdrawal of NATO forces in August 2021, the Taliban have gained control of the country, and this has deepened the economic and humanitarian crisis. Traditionally, poverty and insecurity have been part of the driving factors related to the cultivation, production and trafficking of drugs towards Europe. The Taliban have announced a ban on this in April 2022, but it could be quite difficult to enforce, especially in relation to ephedra, which grows wild all over the country. And there have been record seizures of methamphetamine being trafficked towards Europe from Afghanistan along established heroin routes, which raises concern about the potential increase in supply of this drug to EU drug markets. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 has triggered a major and ongoing humanitarian crisis and has added uncertainty to Europe's drug situation. We know that people accessing opioid agonist treatment will be a small group, but present amongst those seeking humanitarian refuge within the European Union when they come. And their priority needs are likely to include continuity of treatment, language services, and the provision of accommodation and social welfare supports. I'll conclude by just giving you a few of the headlines again, and I hope it's given you a flavour for the wider dimensions of the drugs problems that European countries experience. They're not all experienced to the same extent everywhere. Some of those are present in Ireland, others are not. But we can see that drug supply and use has bounced back after COVID-19 disruption. We can see increased digitalisation of drug markets, probably accelerated during the COVID-19 pandemic period. We can see there's still innovation driving the high availability of a greater diversity of substances, and there is increased synthetic drug production. Large seizures continue and new trafficking routes are emerging. Today, we see that drugs are everywhere and almost everything with a psychoactive potential can be used as a drug. Everyone can be affected, whether directly or indirectly, and the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan and Ukraine also have the potential to impact on Europe's drug problems. The EU Drug Strategy and Action Plan 21 to 25 remains a key framework for the European Union, its member states and its partner countries to take action against these problems. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you all.